You ever been forced to do something so humiliating, so degrading, that it broke something fundamental inside you? Something that couldn't be put back together the same way? Because that's exactly what happened to Marcus on a humid May morning in 1837, when Overseer Silas Crowley walked into the forge at Riverside Plantation in St. Martin Parish, Louisiana, and delivered news that would transform a skilled blacksmith into an architect of slow death. Marcus was 36 years old that spring, standing 6 feet 3 inches tall with shoulders broad enough to carry 2 anvils and hands that could shape metal like clay. Born in Yoruba land before the slavers came, he remembered fragments of his homeland, the smell of palm oil, cooking fires, his father's bronze foundry, the rhythmic pounding of ceremonial drums. His father, Olufemi, had been a master metalworker whose knowledge extended far beyond simple forging. He understood alloys, chemical reactions, the secret properties of metals that could heal or harm. That knowledge had crossed the Atlantic Ocean in the only place it couldn't be chained, inside Marcus's mind. For 11 years, Marcus had worked the forge at Riverside Plantation, creating everything from horseshoes to the very shackles that bound his people. The irony wasn't lost on him, using his ancestral skills to maintain the machinery of his own oppression. But survival required cooperation, and Marcus had perfected the art of appearing broken while remaining dangerously whole inside. The forge sat 150 yards from the main house, a large brick structure with a high ceiling that vented smoke toward Louisiana's eternally gray skies. Inside, the air shimmered with heat, even in winter. 3 anvils of different sizes occupied the space. Surrounded by tools Marcus had either inherited or forged himself. Hammers ranging from delicate tack hammers to massive sledges, tongs configured for every conceivable grip, punches, chisels, swages. Behind a loose brick in the north wall, Marcus maintained what his father had called the apothecary, vials containing metallic compounds, mineral extracts, preparations that could cure or kill depending on dosage and application. Riverside Plantation sprawled across 300 acres of prime Louisiana soil, owned by Master Richard Riverside, a man whose family had grown wealthy on sugar and cotton for 3 generations. Unlike Mississippi cotton plantations, Louisiana operations often combined crops: cotton in the uplands, sugar cane in the lowlands, rice in the wetlands. This diversification made plantations like Riverside exceptionally profitable and exceptionally brutal. Sugar harvest, in particular, was known as the killing season, when enslaved people worked 18-hour days in conditions that routinely claimed lives. Master Richard Riverside was 50 years old in May 1857, a heavy-set man with thinning gray hair and the perpetually flushed face of someone whose blood pressure was climbing toward a stroke. He dressed in fine clothes imported from New Orleans, linen suits, silk vests, leather boots polished to a mirror shine by house slaves who knew that scuff marks meant punishment. He considered himself a progressive master, better than the cruder planters who ruled by whip alone. He believed in scientific management of human property, carefully tracking productivity, nutrition, breeding potential. His enslaved people weren't just assets. They were investments requiring proper maintenance and strategic deployment. His wife, Evelyn Riverside, was 47, a woman whose beauty had been consumed by decades of heat, boredom, and the casual cruelties expected of plantation mistresses. She spent her days managing house slaves with a combination of manipulation and sudden violence, praising one moment and striking the next, keeping everyone off balance and compliant. She had given birth to 7 children, 4 of whom survived past age 5, and now focused her maternal energy on ensuring her daughters married well, and her sons learned proper mastery over lesser beings. But the true daily terror at Riverside Plantation came from Overseer Silas Crowley, and this man requires careful examination because he was the catalyst for everything that followed. Silas Crowley was 44 years old, born to failed farmers in northern Georgia. His father had drunk himself into an early grave, leaving young Silas to survive by selling the one commodity he possessed, his willingness to inflict suffering for wages. By age 19, he was working as a driver on a South Carolina rice plantation, learning how to squeeze maximum labor from human bodies through calculated brutality. By 25, he was an overseer. By 30, he had a reputation as the most effective and most vicious overseer in 3 states. He was not physically imposing, 5 feet 9 inches, lean rather than muscular, with the wiry build of a man who never stopped moving. His face was narrow and sharp-featured, dominated by pale green eyes that seemed to catalog everything, looking for weakness, for resistance, for any excuse to demonstrate power. His hair was the color of rust, always pulled back in a greasy queue. He dressed practically, rough cotton shirts, canvas trousers, heavy boots, and carried his bullwhip coiled on his belt like a badge of office. Silas had been overseer at Riverside for 9 years, managing daily operations with mechanical efficiency. He rose at 4:45 every morning, drank coffee strong enough to strip paint, and was in the fields before the first workers emerged from their quarters. He knew every trick, every form of resistance, every way that enslaved people tried to slow production or sabotage equipment. He countered with a system of informants, surprise inspections, and unpredictable punishments that kept everyone terrified and productive. But Silas's cruelty had a personal dimension that went beyond business. He enjoyed breaking people, especially men who showed pride or dignity. He took particular pleasure in forcing them to submit publicly, to grovel, to beg, making them small in front of their families and communities. He had killed at least 4 enslaved people during his tenure at Riverside, though officially the count was 0 because property can't be murdered. It can only be damaged or destroyed. Silas lived in a modest house near the sugar mill, sharing the space with his younger sister Victoria. She had come to live with him 3 years earlier, after their mother's death, and her presence created a problem that no one in Louisiana's polite society wanted to acknowledge. Victoria Crowley was 27 years old in May 1857, a woman trapped by circumstance and biology. She suffered from epilepsy, what people in that era called falling sickness, a condition that caused unpredictable seizures and made her unmarriageable in a society obsessed with bloodlines and breeding. She was not unattractive. Her features were pleasant enough, with the same rust-colored hair as her brother and pale skin that burned rather than tanned. But no respectable man would risk taking a wife who might pass defective blood to his children, who might collapse during a dinner party, who might embarrass him in front of his peers. Victoria lived in her brother's house essentially as an unpaid servant, cooking his meals, washing his clothes, existing in that terrible limbo between white privilege and social worthlessness. She was lonely, desperately lonely, educated enough to understand her situation, but powerless to change it. Every young man in 3 parishes had looked at her once, learned about her condition, and looked away forever. The enslaved population at Riverside numbered 203 souls in May 1857, divided into strict categories that reinforced hierarchy even among the oppressed. House servants who lived in the main house basement and considered themselves superior. Skilled workers like Marcus who possessed valuable abilities. Field hands who worked from dawn until full dark. children under 12 who performed light tasks while being trained for their future roles in this machine of suffering. The driver at Riverside was a man named Isaac, 55 years old, who had betrayed his people so thoroughly for so long that his soul had calcified into something hard and lightless. He had been promoted to driver 28 years earlier, given authority over other slaves in exchange for absolute loyalty to white power. He carried a short whip and used it freely, always proving his worth, always demonstrating that he was different, that he deserved to survive while others fell. The slave quarters consisted of 26 rough cabins arranged in 3 rows, each housing 6 to 8 people in conditions that would shame a stockyard. Pine log construction with mud-chinking dirt floors, roofs that leaked during Louisiana's torrential rains. Each cabin had 1 door, no windows, and a single fireplace that provided inadequate heat during winter and made the interior unbearable during summer. Privacy was a concept that didn't exist for property. Marcus shared a cabin with 9 others, an elderly couple who had been at Riverside for 45 years, 2 young families with children, and a teenager who worked the sugar mill. They slept on rough pallets, ate their weekly rations of cornmeal and salt pork, and endured, because endurance was the only option besides death. But Marcus had something most didn't: Clara. Clara was 33 years old, enslaved at neighboring Thornhill Plantation 6 miles northeast of Riverside. She worked as the head cook, trusted enough to manage the kitchen, but watched carefully enough that she could never escape. She was beautiful in a way that had brought her nothing but pain, tall and graceful, with skin like polished mahogany and eyes that held depths of strength and sorrow. Her beauty had attracted the previous master's son when she was 15, resulting in 5 years of horror that ended only when the son died in a hunting accident. Since then, the current master had protected her from white attention, recognizing her value as a skilled cook and wanting to maintain peace in his household. Marcus had met Clara 8 years earlier at a Christmas gathering when Master Riverside had allowed his enslaved people to visit neighboring plantations. They had talked for hours, discovering shared histories, both born in Africa, both children of craftsmen, both carrying knowledge that whites didn't know they possessed. Over the following years, they had managed stolen moments at church services, rare social visits, whispered conversations that built into something deeper than their circumstances should have allowed. They had talked about escape. Clara had access to information from conversations she overheard in Thornhill's kitchen. She knew about the Underground Railroad, about abolitionists moving through Louisiana disguised as merchants, about safe houses in Memphis run by freed blacks who risked everything to help fugitives north. Marcus could forge freedom papers. His father had taught him to read and write in secret, and his metalworking skills included engraving. They had discussed routes north, crossing points on the Mississippi River, the dangers of slave catchers and bloodhounds, the reality that even reaching free states didn't guarantee safety under the Fugitive Slave Act. But running meant death if you failed. Men were whipped nearly to death, sometimes castrated, sometimes sold to sugar plantations in the deep bayou, where life expectancy was measured in years. Women faced whipping plus sexual assault as additional punishment. And if you ran, everyone you left behind paid the price. Extra work, reduced rations, increased surveillance, collective punishment designed to discourage resistance. So they had waited, planning, watching for the perfect moment that never seemed to arrive. And then May 18th, 1857 came, and Silas Crowley walked into Marcus's forge with a proposal that shattered everything. The morning had started normally. Marcus rose before dawn, ate cornmeal mush, and headed to the forge as gray light crept across Louisiana's flat landscape. The work that day involved repairing equipment broken during planting season, plow points that had bent against roots, hoe blades that had struck rocks, the endless maintenance required to keep the plantation machine functioning. At approximately 9:30 in the morning, Silas Crowley appeared in the forge doorway. This was unusual. The overseer typically avoided skilled work areas, preferring to focus on the fields where most labor occurred. Marcus continued working, hammer ringing against heated iron, but every nerve went on alert. Visits from Crowley never brought good news. "Stop that noise, boy." Silas's voice cut through the hammer's rhythm. "Need to talk to you." Marcus set down his hammer and turned to face the overseer. Years of survival had taught him to school his face into careful blankness, to make his body language submissive without being obsequious. "Yes, sir." Silas spat tobacco juice onto the forge floor, a deliberate act of disrespect. "You're a strong buck, ain't you? Healthy, good size, no signs of consumption or rot." "Yes, sir." "How old are you now?" 36 years old, sir." "Never been married. No jumping the broom with any of the wenches here at Riverside." Marcus's heart began to accelerate, but he kept his expression neutral. "No, sir. That's going to change." Silas smiled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "My sister Victoria needs a husband. You're going to marry her." The words made no sense at first. Marcus's mind struggled to process them, searching for the trap, the joke, the angle. "Sir, you heard me clear enough. Victoria, she's my sister. Lives with me since our mama died. She's a good Christian woman, works hard, educated even. But she's got a condition." Silas paused, clearly enjoying the moment. "She gets the falling sickness. Seizures. Foams at the mouth, falls down, shakes like the devil's got hold of her. No white man will have her. Which is a goddamn shame because she's got good blood and deserves a family." Marcus said nothing. There was nothing safe to say. Now, I could let her live out her days as a spinster, but that ain't right. She deserves a husband, children, if God wills it. And I've been thinking about who might suit. Silas walked closer, invading Marcus's space, asserting dominance. "You're smart for a Negro. I'll give you that. Best blacksmith in 2 parishes. And you're tall, strong, probably got decent breeding stock in you. And you ain't got any choice in the matter, so you won't give her grief about her condition like a white man might." The full horror crystallized. This wasn't about Victoria's happiness or Marcus's preferences. This was about power, absolute, crushing power that could reach into every corner of enslaved life, even choosing who you shared a bed with. This was humiliation as entertainment. "Sir, don't interrupt me, boy." Silas's hand moved to the whip on his belt. "I know you got your own attachments. That cook from Thornhill Plantation. Clara, is it? Heard you been seeing her at church services. Don't care. You work on this plantation. You belong to Master Riverside, and I manage you for him. If I say you're marrying my sister, you're marrying my sister. Understand? Sir, there's Clara. I've been..." Silas's laugh was like breaking glass. "You've been nothing. You don't have relationships, boy. You don't have preferences or feelings that matter more than a mule's. You're property, and property does what it's told. But, sir, but nothing." Silas's voice dropped to something dangerous. "Now, I'm going to give you a choice, which is more generosity than most overseers would show. You can accept this marriage like a sensible Negro and make the best of it. Victoria ain't a bad woman. She'll cook for you, keep your cabin clean, give you a decent life within reason. Or," he paused for effect, "you can refuse. And if you refuse, I'll have that cook you're sweet on brought here from Thornhill. Master Riverside owes their master a favor, so it won't be hard to arrange. And I'll have her whipped until she can't stand, then sold down to the sugar fields in the deep bayou where you'll never see her again. That clear enough for you?" The threat landed like a physical blow. The sugar plantations in Louisiana's interior were death sentences, brutal labor in swamps and heat, overseers who literally worked people to death because replacing them was cheaper than maintaining them, life expectancy measured in years, not decades. "So what's it going to be, boy? You going to do right by my sister, or you going to let that woman you care about suffer for your stubbornness?" Marcus looked at the overseer's face and saw absolute certainty there. This wasn't a bluff. Silas Crowley would absolutely arrange Clara's torture and sale to prove a point. And Master Riverside would approve because property that didn't obey needed correction. "I'll marry her, sir." "That's what I thought." Silas smiled again. "Wedding will be in 3 weeks. I'll have Reverend Patterson come do it proper. You'll move into a cabin with Victoria. I'm having one of the quarters fixed up special, actual wood floor and furniture. You'll continue your work here during the day, but you'll be her husband at night. That means children, you understand. I expect her to be with child within 6 months. You're a smart Negro. I'm sure you know how to make that happen." "Yes, sir." "Good. Now get back to work. And boy," Silas turned back at the door, "don't even think about running. I got dogs that'll track you through water and swamp, and I'll personally oversee your gelding before I let them finish you. We clear?" "Yes, sir." Silas Crowley walked away, whistling a cheerful tune, leaving Marcus alone with the roaring forge and the sound of his own heart shattering. The hammer felt impossibly heavy in Marcus's hand. For one long, vivid moment, he imagined throwing it. Imagined the satisfying crack it would make against the back of Silas Crowley's skull. Imagined the blood and brain matter spreading across Louisiana dirt. The fantasy was so real, he could almost feel the weight leaving his hand, could almost hear the impact. But he didn't throw the hammer. He turned back to the anvil and resumed working, each strike of metal on metal now carrying a rage that transformed the iron beneath his hands. The metal glowed orange and yellow and white, yielding to his fury, taking whatever shape he demanded. Iron could be controlled. Iron could be forged into anything: tools, weapons, instruments of creation or destruction. If you're feeling rage right now, that's exactly right. This was real. These scenes happened in thousands of variations across the American South. Enslaved people had zero bodily autonomy, no right to choose their partners, no protection against any violation their enslavers wished to inflict. Forced marriages, forced breeding, forced separations, all legal, all common, all justified by the monstrous fiction that some humans weren't fully human. That evening, Marcus made his way through the gathering darkness to the woods beyond the cotton fields, to a clearing where hush harbor services were sometimes held. He needed to think. He needed to pray to gods he wasn't sure existed anymore. He needed to stand under stars that his father had told him were the same stars that shone over Yorubaland, connecting past and present across an ocean of stolen lives. Clara found him there 2 hours later. She had somehow gotten word. Information traveled fast through the underground network of enslaved people who communicated across plantations through drivers, vendors, the mysterious channels that oppressed people always develop. She didn't speak at first, just stood beside him in the darkness, their hands finding each other. "I heard," she finally whispered. "I didn't have a choice." "I know." Her voice was steady, but he could hear tears behind the words. They stood in silence while crickets sang, and somewhere in the distance a whippoorwill called its lonely song. The night air smelled of magnolia and suffering. "We could still run," Clara said quietly. "Tonight, before the wedding. Just disappear into the swamps." Marcus had been thinking the same thing. "They'll torture you, bring you here and destroy you to punish me, and they'll catch us anyway. Silas has bloodhounds. We wouldn't make it 20 miles through the bayou country. Then we fight. Fight how? With what? Against how many?" Marcus turned to face her. "I've thought about it 1,000 times. There are 200 of us here, 40 whites with guns. Even if everyone rose up together, they'd bring the militia from 3 parishes. They'd hang 50 people as examples and sell the rest to the killing fields. Then what?" Clara's voice broke. "We just accept this? Accept that we'll never be together because some evil man decided to use you as a joke for his sister?" Marcus pulled her close, the first time they had ever truly embraced. She fit against him perfectly, and the rightness of it made the situation even more unbearable. "I'll find a way," he whispered into her hair. "I swear to you on my father's memory, I'll find a way. This isn't over." "What way? How?" He didn't answer because he didn't know yet, but standing there in the Louisiana darkness, holding the woman he loved and couldn't have, Marcus made a decision. Not about resistance, not about escape, but about something else entirely. About justice administered slowly, carefully, with the precision his father had taught him. The wedding took place on June 9th, 1850, on a Sunday afternoon after church services. Reverend Thomas Patterson conducted the ceremony, a thin man with a voice like gravel, who saw no contradiction between preaching Christian love and owning 8 enslaved people on his small farm. He read the standard vows with modifications for slave marriages, carefully omitting "till death do us part," because slave marriages had no legal standing and could be dissolved at any moment by a master's whim. Victoria Crowley wore a simple blue dress that hung well on her slender frame. She had tried to look pretty, her rust-colored hair arranged carefully, her face scrubbed clean, a touch of color on her lips. She looked terrified and hopeful in equal measure, a 27-year-old woman who had never been chosen by anyone, now being forced on someone who didn't want her. Marcus wore clean clothes, the best he had: rough cotton shirt, canvas trousers, a vest that had once belonged to a house servant. He maintained a mask of calm acceptance while internally cataloging everything and everyone present. Master Richard Riverside attended, as did his wife Evelyn, both viewing the ceremony as an interesting curiosity worth observing. Several neighboring planters had been invited to witness the spectacle. A white woman marrying a Negro slave. They stood around smirking, making jokes barely loud enough to hear about breeding experiments and whether the offspring would inherit the falling sickness or the Negro's strength. Their wives pretended to be scandalized, while clearly fascinated by the grotesque novelty. Silas Crowley stood near the front, beaming like a proud father, apparently seeing no evil in what he was orchestrating. Perhaps he genuinely believed he was doing something kind for his sister. Perhaps he understood perfectly and simply didn't care. The result was the same either way. The enslaved people of Riverside Plantation attended because they were required to, standing in a silent semicircle around the ceremony. Their faces revealed nothing, but Marcus could feel their pity and their relief. "Better you than me." Only Marcus's mother, Adana, showed emotion, tears running down her weathered face as she watched, her son being used as public entertainment. Clara was not there. She couldn't be there. Watching would have destroyed her. "Do you take this woman to be your wife?" Reverend Patterson intoned. Marcus looked at Victoria. She was trembling, her pale hands clutched together, her green eyes wide with fear and desperate hope. She hadn't chosen this any more than he had. She was a victim too, just a different kind. For a moment he felt something like pity. Then he felt nothing but cold calculation. She was Silas Crowley's sister. She lived in Silas Crowley's house. She would have access to things, would see things, would know things. She could be useful. "I do," Marcus said clearly. The white spectators laughed and applauded, as if they'd witnessed a great triumph of Christian charity, rather than a grotesque violation of human dignity. The enslaved people remained silent, witnesses to yet another atrocity they were powerless to prevent. Reverend Patterson pronounced them husband and wife. Silas clapped Marcus on the shoulder with false friendliness. Master Riverside made a short speech about duty and the civilizing influence of Christian marriage on savage races. Someone produced whiskey, and the white men shared drinks while Marcus and Victoria stood there like livestock that had been successfully bred. The cabin prepared for them was larger than standard quarters, approximately 18 feet by 18 feet, with an actual wooden floor instead of dirt, a real bed frame with a mattress stuffed with Spanish moss, a table with 2 chairs, a fireplace with cooking implements. By slave quarter standards, it was palatial. By human standards, it was still a shack where 2 people would live under constant surveillance with no privacy and no autonomy. That first night, Victoria sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing her blue dress, crying silently. Marcus sat at the table, staring at the wall, his mind calculating and planning. "I'm sorry," Victoria finally whispered. "I know you didn't want this. I didn't want it either. Not like this." Marcus looked at her. "Then why?" "Because Silas said I had to. Because I'm 27 years old and no man will ever choose me because of my condition. And he said this was my only chance to have a husband, maybe children." She wiped her face with trembling hands. "I know what people say about me. I know what I am, but I'm still a person. I still want things that other women want. I'm in love with someone else. I know. Silas told me. He said it didn't matter." Her voice was barely audible. "He said you were property, and property doesn't get to have preferences." They sat in silence while the fire crackled and insects sang outside. Finally, Victoria spoke again. "I won't force you to. We don't have to consummate. Not tonight. Not until you're ready. I'll never be ready. Then we'll figure something out." Her voice cracked. "But please, please don't hate me. I didn't ask for this either." Marcus studied this. Small, frightened white woman trapped by circumstances she couldn't control. Hate was useless. Hate consumed energy better spent elsewhere. And if he was going to survive this, if he was going to find justice, he needed to think strategically. "I don't hate you," he said carefully, "but I can't love you. Ever. I understand. Your brother is a monster." Victoria didn't respond immediately, then very quietly, "Yes, he is." That response told Marcus everything he needed to know. Victoria Crowley might be white, might benefit from the slave system in countless ways, but she also suffered under her brother's brutality. She knew what he was. Perhaps she even hated him. That knowledge would prove very useful. "Tell me about him," Marcus said. "Tell me everything." Over the following weeks, a strange partnership developed between Marcus and Victoria. They were not husband and wife in any real sense. They never consummated the marriage, sleeping on opposite sides of the bed like strangers in a boarding house. But they talked, alone in their cabin at night, away from watching eyes. They developed an alliance born of mutual imprisonment. Victoria told him about her brother's habits, his routines, his weaknesses. She talked about how he drank heavily every night, often passing out by 10 o'clock, how he suffered from terrible headaches that were getting worse, probably from years of alcohol abuse, how he was paranoid about being poisoned, always making her taste his food first, how he kept a detailed ledger documenting every enslaved person he'd ever punished, meticulously recording his cruelties like a merchant recording sales. She described the layout of his house, which rooms he used, where he kept his weapons when he was most vulnerable. She mentioned that he regularly dined at the main house with Master Riverside and his family, always using the fine silverware and china. She talked about his coffee ritual every morning, always from the same copper pot, always in the same pewter cup. She told him about the main house at Riverside, its layout, who slept where, when servants were dismissed for the night. She described Master Riverside's routine, his afternoon naps, his evening bourbon, his habit of taking laudanum to sleep. She mentioned Mistress Evelyn's own laudanum addiction, how the woman was barely conscious most days. She talked about Isaac the driver, how he reported everything to Silas, how he was hated by other enslaved people, but completely loyal to the system that gave him his small measure of power. In return, Marcus told her about the forge, about his father's knowledge, about skills that whites saw only as useful labor, but which could be turned to other purposes. He told her about the hidden compartment behind the brick, about the preparations and compounds he had been accumulating for years without quite knowing why. He explained how metals could be poisonous, how copper could be alloyed with arsenic and antimony in ways that would leach poison slowly into acidic foods and beverages, how lead could be incorporated into pewter vessels that would contaminate anything they held, how these tainted materials would release toxins gradually, not enough to cause immediate death, but enough to accumulate over weeks and months, causing neurological damage, organ failure, excruciating decline. "You're planning to kill him," Victoria said one night. It wasn't a question. "He's already dead," Marcus replied. "He just doesn't know it yet." "And the others? Master Riverside, the mistress, everyone who profits from this system, everyone who thinks they can force people into marriages, separate families, whip children, and sleep peacefully at night." He looked at her directly. "Does that include you?" Victoria was quiet for a long time. "I've benefited from slavery my whole life. The food I ate, the clothes I wore, everything. Bought with money made from stealing people's lives. I didn't choose to be born into this world, but I've participated in it. Does that make me guilty?" "Yes." "Then I'm guilty." She met his eyes. "But I'll help you anyway, because Silas is a monster, and I've watched him commit horrors since I was 8 years old, and I never did anything to stop him. Maybe helping you is how I start to atone. Or maybe," Marcus thought, but didn't say, "you're just trying to survive like everyone else." But her motivation didn't matter. What mattered was that she could provide information, access, and cover. The plan began to take shape over June and July of 1857. It required patience, preparation, and perfect execution. Moving too quickly would mean failure and death. Moving too slowly risked discovery, or changes that would make the plan impossible. The timing needed to be precise. First, Marcus needed to create the weapons, not knives or guns, which would be noticed immediately, but something subtler, something that would kill slowly enough that natural disease would be the assumed cause. He began with copper. Pure copper is relatively harmless, but copper alloyed with arsenic and antimony becomes something different. The arsenic came from mineral deposits he knew about from his explorations of the surrounding swamps. Orpiment and realgar, yellow and red arsenic sulfides that could be processed into pure arsenic trioxide with careful heating and grinding. He collected the minerals gradually over weeks. explaining to anyone who asked that he was gathering materials for special bronze work Master Riverside had requested. Once collected, he processed them carefully in the forge late at night when everyone else slept, heating the minerals in a sealed clay crucible to drive off sulfur, leaving behind arsenic oxide that could be mixed into copper alloys. The antimony came from stibnite deposits he found in a creek bed, gray metallic mineral that yielded antimony when smelted. Combined with arsenic and copper in carefully calculated ratios, the result was an alloy that looked identical to ordinary copper, but would leach poison into anything acidic that touched it: coffee, wine, citrus, tomatoes, vinegar. He began forging new cookware for the main house. In early July, he told Isaac that the old copper pots were wearing out and needed replacement. Isaac, who understood nothing about metallurgy, approved the project and reported to Master Riverside that the blacksmith was being productive and diligent. Over 6 weeks, Marcus replaced approximately 35 pieces of cookware and tableware at the main house: coffee pots, cooking vessels, serving platters, cups, wine goblets. Some pieces were pure copper, untainted. These he marked with a tiny notch on the handle that only he could identify. These were for enslaved people to use. The contaminated pieces had no mark. They were intended for whites only. He also created a special pewter cup for Silas Crowley's morning coffee, pewter being a lead-tin alloy that Marcus enriched with additional lead and a touch of arsenic. He gave it to Victoria, who replaced her brother's regular cup with this new one, telling him it was a gift to show her appreciation for arranging her marriage. Silas accepted it without suspicion, pleased that his sister seemed happy with her Negro husband. By mid-August, the trap was fully set. Every meal Master Riverside ate was prepared in poisoned vessels. Every drink Mistress Evelyn took came from contaminated cups. Every morning, Silas Crowley drank his coffee from a cup that was slowly destroying his nervous system. And they had no idea. The waiting was torture. Marcus went about his daily work, hammering iron, repairing equipment, appearing completely normal while internal murder was being carried out through chemistry and patience. He saw Clara occasionally at church services, brief moments where they could exchange glances but not words. She didn't know the details of his plan. It was safer that way. But she could see something had changed in him. The despair was gone, replaced by something cold and patient. In late August, Silas Crowley began showing the first symptoms: stomach cramps that he attributed to bad pork, headaches that wouldn't respond to laudanum, irritability even worse than usual, tremors in his hands that made it difficult to write in his punishment ledger. He complained constantly, dosing himself with patent medicines that did nothing because patent medicines couldn't cure heavy metal poisoning. He blamed the heat, blamed bad food, blamed Victoria's cooking. He never suspected that the decorated pewter cup he drank from every morning was the source of his suffering. By September, Master Riverside was showing symptoms too: confusion, difficulty concentrating, sudden outbursts of rage, followed by periods of strange lethargy. His hands developed tremors. His gait became unsteady. His wife thought it was apoplexy, that common affliction of overweight men who drank too much. She increased his laudanum doses, which only made things worse by adding opium poisoning to the mix. Mistress Evelyn's symptoms were harder to distinguish from her usual laudanum-induced fog, but her seizures increased in frequency and severity. Her skin took on a grayish pallor. She lost weight rapidly, unable to keep food down. The plantation physician was called in late September. Dr. Marcus Hebert examined all 3 patients, prescribed bloodletting and calomel, a mercury-based medicine that actually added more poison to their systems. and declared that a mysterious ague was affecting the household. He advised rest, bland foods, prayer. He never suspected poisoning because why would he? These were wealthy white people dying slowly in their own homes. Marcus watched it all unfold with satisfaction. He didn't bother to hide from Victoria. "They're dying like slaves die," he told her one night. "Slowly, painfully, without dignity, while everyone around them goes about their business as if it's normal. Justice." "Silas is suffering terribly," Victoria said quietly. "I should feel bad about that." "Do you?" "No. I feel relief. Is that wrong?" "I don't know what's right or wrong anymore. I only know what's necessary." By October, Silas Crowley could barely function. His mind was deteriorating faster than his body. He forgot names of enslaved people he'd known for years, flew into rages over imaginary insults, hallucinated threats that didn't exist. He still tried to oversee the plantation, but Isaac the driver had essentially taken over daily operations while the overseer slowly lost his grip on reality. Master Riverside was in even worse condition. He could no longer walk unassisted, his legs having lost coordination and strength. His speech became slurred. Sometimes he thought it was 20 years earlier, and he was courting Evelyn. Sometimes he knew exactly where he was and screamed in frustration at his failing body, demanding that someone fix him, cure him, restore what was being stolen piece by piece. The family physician visited weekly now, increasingly baffled. He had seen wasting diseases before, but never affecting multiple household members simultaneously with such varied symptoms. He suggested it might be contaminated well water, and recommended they switch to rainwater collection. This did nothing, of course, because the poison wasn't in the water. It was in the very vessels they used to drink it. Mistress Evelyn suffered seizures almost daily now, violent convulsions that left her exhausted and terrified. She prayed constantly when conscious, convinced God was testing her faith, never realizing that God had nothing to do with what was happening to her body. Her personal maid, an elderly woman named Ruth, cared for her with genuine compassion, not knowing that her mistress was being murdered by the cookware she ate from. The plan was working perfectly, too perfectly. Marcus began to worry that multiple deaths happening simultaneously might trigger suspicion even in an era of limited medical knowledge. He needed to vary the timeline, make some deaths happen faster, while slowing others to create a more natural pattern. He stopped replacing Silas's coffee cup with fresh, poisoned versions, instead occasionally substituting a clean cup that Victoria would accidentally use instead. This slowed the progression of Silas's symptoms slightly, which made doctors think he might be recovering while the others worsened. This would make his eventual death seem like a sudden relapse rather than part of a pattern. For Master Riverside, Marcus did the opposite. He created a special invalid's feeding cup, supposedly to make it easier for the master to drink broth and medicines. He presented it to Isaac, explaining that he'd heard the master was having difficulty drinking and had made this as a gesture of concern for the man who owned him. Isaac, touched by this apparent display of loyalty, brought the cup to the main house himself. Master Riverside began using it for all liquids: water, broth, wine, medicine. The cup was saturated with poison. Every molecule of the copper arsenic alloy was designed to leach toxins into whatever it touched. Master Riverside's decline accelerated dramatically over the next 2 weeks. October 28th, 1857 dawned cool and overcast, the first real cold snap of autumn reaching Louisiana. Marcus woke before sunrise as always, but this morning felt different. He had been watching the progression of symptoms carefully, tracking them against his father's teachings about poison timelines. His calculations told him that today or tomorrow would be the day for Master Riverside. He was right. At approximately 7 o'clock in the morning, a scream came from the main house. Not the controlled scream of a lady having vapors, but a raw sound of pure terror. Marcus was already at the forge, but set down his tools and walked calmly toward the commotion, joining other enslaved people who were gathering to see what had happened. Master Richard Riverside was on the floor of his bedroom, convulsing violently. Foam flecked his lips, tinged with blood. His eyes had rolled back in his head, showing only whites. His limbs jerked and twisted in patterns that looked almost choreographed, a grotesque dance of dying nerves. Mistress Evelyn stood in the corner, screaming for help, screaming for God, screaming for someone to do something. House slaves hovered uselessly, terrified to touch the master without permission, but equally terrified of being blamed for not helping. Isaac had been summoned and was already there, backing away from the dying man in horror. "Get Dr. Hebert," he shouted at a house slave. "Run, now." But there was no speed that would help now. Marcus watched from the doorway as Master Richard Riverside, owner of Riverside Plantation, enslaver of 203 human beings, died on the floor of his bedroom in agony. It took approximately 15 minutes for his body to finish the process. His bowels released. Black blood poured from his mouth and nose. He screamed once, a sound of pure animal terror that everyone present would remember for the rest of their lives. The sound of a man facing judgment from a power he had never believed could touch him. Then silence. Dr. Hebert arrived 30 minutes later, examined the body, and declared that the master had succumbed to apoplexy, likely brought on by the same mysterious ague that had been affecting the household. He prescribed increased vigilance for Mistress Evelyn and recommended that she be moved to her sister's home in New Orleans until the sickness passed. He collected his fee of $8 and left, never suspecting that he had just examined a murder victim. Master Riverside was buried 2 days later in an elaborate ceremony attended by planters from 5 parishes. White neighbors spoke in hushed tones about the tragedy of such a prominent man dying so young, only 50 years old, in the prime of his life. Reverend Patterson delivered a eulogy praising Richard Riverside's Christian character, his business acumen, his dedication to civilizing savage races through the divine institution of slavery. Several men wept openly at the loss of such a good friend and noble soul. Their wives dabbed at their eyes with lace handkerchiefs. The enslaved people of Riverside stood at the back of the gathering, maintaining expressions of appropriate sadness, while internally marking this day as one small victory in a war that would outlive them all. Marcus attended the funeral and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. One down. 4 days after Master Riverside's death, Mistress Evelyn followed him into the grave. Despite being moved to her sister's home in New Orleans, despite being attended by 3 different physicians, despite being prayed over by ministers and dosed with every medicine the 1857 medical establishment could provide, she continued to decline. Her seizures became almost constant. Her body wasted away despite efforts to feed her. On November 3rd, after a particularly violent seizure that lasted nearly 20 minutes, she simply stopped breathing. Age 47. Wealthy, respected, and completely unaware that she had been murdered with elegant precision by people she had considered property. Her funeral was held in New Orleans at St. Louis Cathedral, a grand affair attended by Louisiana's finest families. The newspapers published obituaries praising her charitable work, her devotion to family, her grace under suffering. They speculated about the mysterious illness that had claimed both her and her husband within a week. suggesting it might be related to miasmas from the swamps, or perhaps divine will beyond human understanding. Marcus heard about her death 3 days later through the network of enslaved people who communicated between plantations. He felt no joy, no celebration, just a quiet sense of accounts being settled. 2 down. Silas Crowley lasted another month, his decline a study in neurological deterioration. By mid-November, he could barely speak coherently. His hands shook so badly he couldn't hold a pen to write in his punishment ledger. He suffered from paranoid delusions, convinced that enslaved people were plotting against him, which was both true and impossible for him to prove. He became violent in his confusion, lashing out at Victoria, at Isaac, at anyone who came near him. Victoria moved out of his house, taking refuge in the cabin she shared with Marcus, genuinely frightened of her brother for the first time in her life. "He's not himself anymore," she told Marcus one night, her voice shaking. "He looks at me like he doesn't know who I am, like I'm a stranger or an enemy." "That's the poison destroying his brain," Marcus explained calmly. "The lead and arsenic accumulate in nervous tissue. They interfere with the signals that make thoughts and memories and personality. He's dissolving from the inside out." "Is he in pain?" "Constant pain. Headaches that feel like his skull is splitting open. Muscle cramps. Burning in his stomach and throat. Confusion that must be terrifying. Knowing something is wrong, but not being able to understand what." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "Good," she finally said. "Let him suffer. Let him feel a fraction of what he made others feel." On December 7th, 1857, Silas Crowley died in his small house near the sugar mill. He was found by Isaac the next morning, lying on the floor, having suffered what appeared to be a massive stroke. His face was frozen in an expression of terror and rage. His hands were clenched into fists. His body had voided itself completely. No one mourned him except Victoria, who wept briefly, not from grief, but from relief, and the complicated emotions that come from watching a family member who terrorized you finally stop terrorizing everyone. His funeral was small, attended mainly by other overseers who respected his efficiency even if they hadn't liked him personally. Reverend Patterson delivered a perfunctory service. Silas Crowley was buried in an unmarked grave in the plantation cemetery, and within a week, people had mostly stopped talking about him. The enslaved people of Riverside Plantation didn't stop talking about him, though. They whispered about justice, about divine retribution, about how the cruel overseer had finally gotten what he deserved. Children who had been whipped by his hand, women who had been violated by his authority, men who had been humiliated under his oversight. All of them marked his death as a moment of cosmic balance, however temporary. Marcus attended the funeral and felt a satisfaction so deep it was almost spiritual. 3 down, the primary targets eliminated, but he wasn't finished. 3 deaths were satisfying, but justice required more. Isaac the driver was still alive, still carrying his little whip, still betraying his own people to maintain his fragile position of power. And there were others in the network of cruelty, people who had supported the system, participated in the oppression, benefited from the machinery of suffering. The problem was that expanding the death count would definitely trigger investigation. 3 deaths in the same household could be attributed to disease. 7 or 10 would look suspicious, even to physicians with 1857-level medical knowledge. Marcus needed to be selective and strategic. He chose 4 additional targets. First, Isaac the driver. This traitor had spent 28 years selling out his own people for scraps from the master's table. He had beaten children. He had reported escape attempts. He had testified against enslaved people in court, sending them to the gallows or the auction block. He deserved what was coming. Second, Dr. Marcus Hebert, the family physician. This man had examined countless enslaved people over his career, declaring them fit for sale despite obvious illness, prescribing brutal treatments that killed more often than cured. He had attended dinners at Riverside House dozens of times, always drinking from the fine copper wine goblets Marcus had forged. Third, Reverend Thomas Patterson, the minister who had conducted the forced wedding. This supposed man of God owned 8 enslaved people himself and preached sermons justifying the institution every Sunday. He had taken tea at Riverside House many times, always using the special pewter service reserved for clergy. Fourth, James Crowley, Silas's cousin, who served as overseer at neighboring Magnolia Plantation and had attended the wedding as a witness. He visited Riverside frequently, often staying for supper, always using the guest china that had been replaced in August. Over the following weeks, these 4 men began showing symptoms. Isaac developed tremors and confusion, his formerly sharp mind beginning to fog. Dr. Hebert complained of stomach pains and dizziness that interfered with his practice. Reverend Patterson had seizures, including one during Sunday service, when he collapsed behind his pulpit while preaching about obedience. James Crowley became increasingly paranoid and violent at Magnolia Plantation, convinced his enslaved people were plotting against him, which they probably were, given his brutality, though not in the way he imagined. Dr. Hebert died first on December 29, 1837, officially from heart failure. His colleague from Baton Rouge performed a cursory autopsy and found nothing unusual except general organ deterioration that could be attributed to age and occupational stress. Reverend Patterson died on January 3, 1858, during another seizure, this one fatal. His death was attributed to apoplexy and considered a tragedy by his congregation, who mourned without ever knowing their spiritual leader had been an active participant in evil. Isaac died on January 9, 1858, alone in his small house near the quarters. His body was found by a field hand the next morning. No one mourned him except the new overseer, who had found him useful for information. The enslaved people of Riverside considered his death a blessing, whispering that divine justice had finally caught up with the traitor. James Crowley's death was the most dramatic. On January 15th, he became convinced that enslaved people were poisoning him, which was somewhat accurate, though he had the wrong plantation and the wrong method. He armed himself with pistols and barricaded himself in his house at Magnolia Plantation. For 3 days, he fired at anyone who approached, black or white, screaming about conspiracies and demons. Finally, on the 4th day, he died from a massive seizure. His brain so poisoned, it simply ceased functioning. 7 deaths over 3 months. The white community was now genuinely terrified. Emergency meetings were held at churches and town halls. Militias were formed to guard against slave uprisings. Enslaved people throughout the parish were questioned, sometimes brutally, about whether they knew anything about plots or poisonings. Several innocent people were whipped on suspicion alone, their bodies sacrificed to white fear. But suspicion never fell on Marcus. Why would it? He was a skilled blacksmith, recently married to a white woman, appearing grief-stricken by the deaths of his master and mistress. He was the model of a domesticated, trustworthy slave. He continued his work at the forge, kept his head down, maintained his mask of submission while 7 bodies went into Louisiana soil. Victoria knew, of course. She saw his satisfaction, his careful monitoring of who died and when. She never said anything to anyone, bound to him now by complicity, and something that might have been respect or might have been shared trauma. After her brother's death, she inherited his modest savings, about $300, a fortune for someone in her position. She offered Marcus his freedom. "I can't legally free you," she said quietly one night in their cabin. "But I can help you escape. I have money. I have connections. I can get you to Memphis, put you in contact with Underground Railroad conductors. You could be in Canada within a month." Marcus considered the offer. For one moment, he imagined it, walking away from Louisiana, from slavery, from this carefully constructed web of revenge, walking toward Clara, toward freedom, toward a life that was actually his own. But then he thought about all the others, the enslaved people still suffering, the overseers still brutally enforcing the system, the masters still growing wealthy on stolen labor, the ministers still preaching that slavery was God's will, the doctors still examining human beings like livestock, the entire machine still grinding people into cotton bales and sugar barrels and profit margins. "I'm not done yet," he said. "How many more?" "I don't know. I'll know when it's finished." In truth, the main work was complete. The primary architects of his humiliation were dead. Silas Crowley had died in confusion and terror. Master Riverside had died convulsing on his bedroom floor. Mistress Evelyn had died screaming. The collaborators had followed them into unmarked graves. Justice had been served slowly and precisely through the careful application of ancestral knowledge that white people had never respected enough to fear. In late January, Marcus finally went to see Clara. He traveled to Thornhill Plantation under the pretense of delivering repaired equipment, timing his arrival for Sunday evening, when enslaved people gathered for their own services in the woods. He found her at the edge of the gathering singing a spiritual about crossing Jordan's water. When she saw him, she broke away from the group, and they walked into the woods together, far enough from others to speak privately. "I heard what happened at Riverside," she said. 7 deaths. 10, actually," Marcus corrected quietly. "But who's counting?" Clara looked at him carefully in the moonlight, filtering through the trees. "You did this?" "Yes." "How?" He told her everything. The metallurgical poisons, the contaminated vessels, the gradual accumulation of toxins that mimic disease. He told her about Victoria's help, about the patience required, about watching his enemies die slowly while maintaining perfect innocence. Clara was quiet for a long time, her hand in his, both of them standing in Louisiana woods that had witnessed too much suffering and not enough justice. "Was it worth it?" she finally asked. "Was it worth it?" Marcus repeated. "They forced me into a grotesque marriage to humiliate me. They threatened to destroy you if I refused. They stole our chance to be together. They built their wealth on stolen lives and acted like they were doing us a favor by feeding us enough to work. Was killing them worth it?" He looked at her directly. "Yes, every moment of their suffering was worth it. And now? What happens now? Now we run. Eventually someone will investigate the poisonings more thoroughly. They'll examine the cookware, maybe find the contamination. I need to be gone before that happens." "When?" "Tonight. There's a full moon. We can follow the North Star. Use the bayous to throw off dogs. Victoria gave me money and contacts. We can pay for passage north, find Underground Railroad conductors, make it to Canada." Clara looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You killed 10 people, Marcus. 10. Even if they were monsters, even if they deserved it, that changes a person. Are you still the man I fell in love with?" Marcus considered the question honestly. "No, I'm not. The man you loved believed in patience, believed in waiting for divine justice. That man died the day Silas Crowley gave me a choice between accepting humiliation or watching you be destroyed. The person I am now understands that oppressors never stop on their own. They have to be stopped. I don't know if I can love that person. Then don't. But come with me anyway, because if you stay here, you'll spend the rest of your life as property. We can sort out love or not love once we're free. Clara stood there in the Louisiana woods, weighing her options. Stay in slavery but relatively safe, or run with a man who had become a killer, risk death by bloodhounds or slave catchers, but possibly, just possibly, reach freedom. She made her choice. Tonight, then, I'll meet you at Sweet Creek Crossing at midnight. They ran that night, January 28th, 1858, following streams and bayous, traveling only at night, hiding during the day in caves and abandoned structures. They had close calls, hearing bloodhounds in the distance, seeing patroller campfires once passing within yards of a slave catcher camp. But Marcus's preparation served them well. He had forged freedom papers claiming they were free blacks traveling to visit relatives. He had money to bribe suspicious parties. He had knowledge of plants that kept bloodhounds at bay when rubbed on shoes and clothing. They traveled for 4 weeks, covering over 300 miles, crossing from Louisiana into Arkansas, then into Missouri, and finally into Illinois. Near Cairo, they made contact with Underground Railroad conductors, Quaker families who risked everything to move fugitives toward freedom. On February 29th, 1858, Leap Day, they crossed into Canada at Detroit, stepping onto truly free soil for the first time in their lives. Clara collapsed in tears. Marcus stood looking back toward the United States, toward the South, feeling nothing except cold determination and hard-won freedom. They settled in Chatham, Ontario, a community of several hundred fugitive slaves who had made the same desperate journey. Marcus found work as a blacksmith, his skills respected and valued without the taint of slavery. Clara found work as a cook and eventually opened a small restaurant that became known throughout the community. They married, really married, legally married, in April 1858, exactly 2 years after Silas Crowley had first made his obscene proposal. They built a small house. They had 4 children over the following years. They lived free. But Marcus never forgot. Every year, on the anniversary of Master Riverside's death, he would light a candle and sit alone, remembering. He felt no guilt, none. These people had participated in a system that stole lives, destroyed families, and treated human beings as livestock. They had profited from horror. They had died for their sins, and the world was better for their absence.